But let me say something about this panel. This is an interesting one because it's going to continue, of course, with the theme of suffering, but looking at it from very different angles. This is a slightly more philosophical focus now, which follows on many of the ideas that Professor Nasser had introduced in his lecture, which was of course very wonderful. So the first speaker is none other than the PI of this project, Professor Muhammad Faruque, whom I had the pleasure of meeting many years ago in Iran. And at that time, he was, I guess, an MA student or something like that. And just the hunger and the thirst and the desire and the interest and everything, it captivated me. And he's a close friend, and we've collaborated on many things over the years. And I've learned so much from his work. Now, he's currently the Inayat Malik Assistant Professor at the University of Cincinnati. His research lies at the intersection of religion, science, philosophy, and literature, especially in relation to the Islamic intellectual tradition. Professor Faruque earned his PhD with distinction from the University of California, Berkeley, and served as exchange scholar at Harvard University and as George Amos postdoctoral fellow at Fordham University. His highly acclaimed book, Sculpting the Self, addresses what it means to be human in a secular post-Enlightenment world by exploring notions of selfhood and subjectivity in Islamic and non-Islamic literatures, including modern philosophy and neuroscience. And here's the book right here. Whenever I have a copy of somebody's book, if I can put it up there, I must. So there it is. Well, I'm not going to say much about the book right now. It'll come out maybe later. Dr. Faruque's work has been supported by Templeton Foundation grants, the Amos Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the Bestway Foundation, among others, and has appeared in a number of major peer-reviewed journals, such as Philosophy East and West, Arabic Sciences and Philosophy, published by Cambridge University Press, Journal of Sufi Studies, published by Brill, Religious Studies, Cambridge University Press, and Ancient Philosophy. And while his past research has explored modern and pre-modern conceptions of selfhood and identity and their bearing on ethics, religion, science, and culture, his current project investigates whether or not Sufi philosophy and practice, as articulated in the School of Ibn Arabi, support and foster an active engagement toward the planet's well-being and an ecologically viable way of life and vision. And he is also at work on a book on artificial intelligence and the ethical challenges of information technology. So I'm going to give the floor over to him. The title of his lecture, it's a provocative title, Hume on trial, David Hume on trial. Can evil and suffering be justified?
Thank you, Professor Rustam, for that really very kind introduction. Zanda Bashit. Louis, would I be able to share my screen? Oh, great. So I have some slides. Let me try to put my slides on the screen first. All right, I hope everyone is able to see the slides. Professor Rustam, are you able to see the slides?
Yes, yeah, I can see it.
Wonderful. Let me just quickly check. All right, so let me just begin with some general comments. With the pandemic is still raging, and which has unleashed an enormous amount of suffering on millions of people. Many are asking this question: where is God in all this? Does he not care about his creation? Is he simply powerless, or does he simply not exist? In fact, for an atheist, it's like all this suffering kind of puts God on trial. So it's like we can imagine this courtroom scenario. So I have this courtroom scenario. So especially in light of all of this suffering, and especially in light of the pandemic, imagine this is a trial, and it's like even putting God on trial. So the atheist stands up and points to the sheer amount and degree of suffering in the world. He reminds the jury of particular instances of horrendous suffering, telling us stories so awful that we are tempted to turn away. Now, imagine God witnessing such suffering. He tells us, if he exists, he's right there. He's perfect. He's all-powerful. He could stop this suffering at any moment, but he does not. He doesn't. the courtroom is silent. The only explanation, the atheist concludes, is that the God you have been led to believe in does not and cannot exist. So you can see this is a very it's a very complicated issue, especially if we are looking at it from lots of different perspectives. So I'm imagining, I'm thinking of our current society. We live in a secular society where we have people who believe in God, believe in forms of transcendence, but we also have lots of millions of people who do not believe in any form of transcendence or God. Actually, since especially after the Holocaust and the World War II, in the last 50, 60 years, many people have turned away from religion, and it seems to be a kind of abiding question for a lot of people, even who believe in God, because they see all of this suffering, tremendous amount of suffering, and then they think about the role of God, or they think about the absence of God. So it is a question, and a lot of people simply believe, come to the negative conclusion that, all right, it simply shows that there is no God, or if there is a God, he simply does not care. So this goes really right into the heart of the matter, especially if you're thinking about the pandemic, especially if you're thinking about someone who has lost their loved ones, or who has experienced suffering himself or herself. This is not a mere philosophical issue. It's not like you go to a philosophy classroom and then you take a course on philosophy of religion, or in some other course and some modules on the question of evil and suffering, and consider various logical problems of evil and evidential. There is a theoretical dimension to it, but it's also even those theoretical issues. Because I personally, when I teach, a lot of people, including Muslims, including people from other religions, or people who have no belief in God, they ask me about this question, the role of God in suffering and so forth. So this question, these issues, or what I'm trying to address in the talk, goes right into the heart of the matter. So let me, because I'll be talking about lots of different things, let me try to kind of outline what I'm going to do. I think that way we can follow. So this is a difficult topic. So I've written a paper I can show you. I've already written more than 10,000 words. It'll be published, as we mentioned. We have also the edited volume, and you can see all the footnotes. There are all sorts of long footnotes and etc. But as we mentioned, we really want these talks to be accessible to a wider audience. So I decided to kind of leave all the references in the slides and just focus on the main arguments and kind of explain things without jargon and so forth, so that we all can follow. Because I personally believe, and I'm not talking, just like in the morning we have seen how, for example, Cyrus, he was mentioning someone, a close relative who suffered during the pandemic, and he now was even in a more serious case. She was also speaking from personal experience. I also have had such experiences during the pandemic and also at other times. And this is something don't want to get into too personal, but it's, for me as well, it's a deeply personal issue, the question of evil, both in terms of my humble life experience, but also in terms of the way I think about the nature of reality, role of God, nature of human being, and so forth. So for me, this is not at all one of those academic issues. I really want to make it clear, even though some of this might sound a little bit quote unquote philosophical, but that's what it is. So I will consider very many of these various atheistic objections to the problem of evil and suffering first. And then I will argue that these objections misconstrue the meaning of suffering by assuming that the goal of creation should be a custom-made paradise populated by weak and hedonistic humans seeking to maximize their pleasure. I'll further argue that the goal of creation is the human being's spiritual development and ultimate perfection, for which suffering in life can be a means to actualize one's latent spiritual and ethical flourishing. So that's the kind of rough outline. All right. So let me begin with some case. Actually, my talk will be full of case studies and examples. So I'm also looking forward to the Q&A. I really love to hear what people think. So let me begin with this hypothetical example. Actually, this is from a philosopher called William Rowe. He wrote a number of papers on this, and he is one of those people who argues that there is no God because we have too much evidence of evil, and they just simply don't make sense. They render the existence of God somehow very, like nearly impossible. So just imagine this case study. In some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree. Just a moment, let me keep track of time because I have lots of things to say, and I know it's just 30 minutes and I'm not reading. So I just want to make sure I'm on the time. I'm following the time, all right. So in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horridly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. So imagine this kind of potential scenarios of suffering, where, because why am I beginning with this? It's kind of really rather stark and kind of not unpleasant at all. Because a lot of the time, atheists argue that you hear religious people talking about suffering in a very general way, and they say that suffering has spiritual benefits, or it leads to kind of spiritual growth and all of that. But there seems to be those cases where you have a suffering that does not seem to benefit the entity, in this case, an innocent animal, at all. It's like meaningless. All right, you can imagine. So this is not a real, but according to Rowe, this kind of phenomena are kind of quite regular. It happens all the time. You can easily imagine an animal trapped in that kind of setting, and before its death, it went to this terrible agonizing pain. So you can simply ask, all right, in nature, you have to have this balance, and otherwise there's overpopulation. And so there has to be natural disasters and so forth. All right, it's all part of the divine plan. But does this have to be this bad? Like, why was it not the case that the animal simply died just with the first stroke of a lightning? Why there had to be that kind of prolonged pain? That does not seem to make sense. So this is that's the first scenario. And another case study, and this is a real life story. Again, this is from Rowe, but you can Google it up. This is actually reported in about 30 some years ago in 1986. It involves a 5-year-old girl in Michigan who was severely beaten, raped, and then strangled to death early on New Year's Day in 1986. So I don't have to go through the details. It's a true story. But you can see this is a case of an innocent 5-year-old. And she was raped, beaten by someone who was the boyfriend of her mother. So again, you can imagine. All right, this is extremely what did the girl gain? What was the spiritual gain or religious or whatever? It simply seems to be something that does not seem to make sense. So philosophers have come up with lots of terms, and I don't really want this to be kind of jargon-laden talk. So they term this kind of incidents as horrendous evil. Again, not getting into the technical definition, but simply in simple terms, pointless evil. All right, some evil, something happens and it leads to, you can point out some spiritual gain or some benefits here and there, lots of, different ways. But these cases seems to suggest some kind of pointless, phenomenon where, it's just does not seem to make sense. And therefore, if there's God, and if God is by definition compassion, caring, and etc., God should have done something about it. So, and there are many such cases. So overall, all of these evidences together show that probably God does not exist. I say probably because these philosophers distinguish between purely logical a problem of evil, which is just logical, like Plantinga and others, if you guys have read and responded to some of this, like God is powerful, God is omnipotent, omniscient, etc., but the world contains suffering, etc., and they're kind of incompatible with some of these divine attributes, so hence God does not exist. That's a kind of logical, and people have it's very controversial. It's not very convincing, even for many atheists. But this is a kind of evidential. People use probabilistic theories. Like this guy uses Bayesian probability theory, which is, I find it so ironic. Thomas Bayes actually was a theologian and mathematician, wrote the book called Doctrine of Chance, so chance, to actually prove God. But today it's being used to disprove God. Anyway, this is just an ironic fact in history. Anyway, that was a footnote. But anyway, so they're saying probabilistically, there are all of these cases that seem to suggest probably God does not exist. All right, let me move on. So these are the ways some of the modern day atheists kind of are arguing about the problem of evil. But if we go back to history in the Western tradition, we can trace where all this is coming from. So these things come ultimately from Pierre, Bayle. Of course, Leibniz was the one first wrote that book on essay on theology in French. But it was really David Hume who really kind of brought all this into the open, like many other things. So David Hume, very well-known figure, hailed as one of the great Enlightenment figures. But again, depending on whose side you're on, you can see him as a great Enlightenment, especially a Scottish Enlightenment figure, Herbinger, kind of great figure when it comes to modernity, etc. Made all these tremendous strides in ethics, epistemology, but at the same time, if you don't agree with him, you'd find his empirical epistemology and his kind of spiritless ethics, and also his comments, some of his comments about slavery, about Native Americans are just purely racist. So he's depending on whose side you're on, you can see him in both ways. But regardless, he's a very important figure, and he wrote on all of these topics, including religion. So he has formulated some of these objections. He calls them circumstances, I call them, but they are really like objections. Although people doubt whether he himself was an atheist, but he was certainly not a kind of traditional believer. He might have been an atheist or might have been a deist, but anyway, that's kind of irrelevant. And these things are from his book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. So in brief, all of these things, examples that atheists point out, they, at least for inspiration, actually Rowe and Draper, many others directly mention Hume, but they go back to Hume and his famous objections about the problem of suffering. So I really wanted to go to the root of the problem. So to really understand what's going on here, why is it that so many people in the West, especially in yes, Holocaust, yes, and in some of these media reports about tsunamis, Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, Indonesia, and many other such events, making people kind of doubtful about God's existence. But at the same time, there's a kind of deep intellectual root to all this. So we have to really go back to Hume to understand what's going on. So he has all of these 4 objections. They're kind of interrelated. Let's talk about them. Oh, wow, already 15 minutes. I'll try to be brief here. I'm more or less done with the objections. So the first objection, if only, Hume is saying, if only living beings were incapable of pain, life would have been much more comfortable. So why is it that, we have so much pain, there are feelings of pleasure, which are easy to understand, but sometimes we feel hunger, sometimes we feel lazy, etc. Why is it that God has created that way? Why not have a creature, have human beings in a way where you simply would not have any of this pain? And life would have been much better. Why didn't God do that? And then the next objection, why it is that an omnipotent deity, God, who knows all the secrets of the universe, including what's in everyone's mind, cannot make use of his particular volitions to neutralize all would-be evils. So think about 9/11, the horrible event of 9/11, or think about the tragedy of the gun, the person who massacred Muslims in New Zealand a few years ago, right? Think about God's role. Think about God secretly interfering just before all of these events and stopping these people from committing these horrible acts. Life would have been much better, right? I mean, imagine the Islamophobia people face in this country and the ripple effects of 9/11, just change a lot of things, right? Yeah, life would have been much better. So Hume is wondering, I mean, is God simply powerless, or why is he not doing that? So I'll come back to these things, but let me just explain what Hume is trying to say. And then the third objection: if only animals and humans were endowed with superabundant abilities beyond a strict minimal survival limit. Again, kind of limited. Hume is trying to say, yeah, God has given us some energy, some power, hands, and mind and thinking, but it's just enough. It's not like too much. Imagine how many of us have missed lots of deadlines, myself, in trying to be very careful about deadlines. But during the COVID, you always felt like something was happening, or sometime you yourself was feeling sick. So you're not able to manage a lot of you're not able to complete a lot of the deadlines, right? So what we have, all the abilities, Hume is saying, it's just bare minimum. God could have given us more, and life would have been much better. But that's not the case. So it's just we're simply miserable creatures, and that just happens to be the case. God does not care, or maybe he does not exist, according to this line of reasoning. And finally, what we observe in nature, as ordained by providence, may be just enough to keep us going. But could the universe not have been less hostile or contain less evil than what we encounter at present? So it's kind of related. And again, now thinking about the nature as a whole, yeah, we need fire, but do we have to have all these wildfires in California, like killing lots of, destroying hundreds of homes, killing people? And yeah, we need to have viruses, diseases, and part of the game, overpopulation, finite space. Yeah, but do we have to have COVID? Pandemic, 15 millions, according to some estimates, over 20 millions, and more than 500 million, like people suffering or dying, and so forth. So, I mean, it could have been less hostile, right? So Hume is kind of saying, I mean, just objecting to God and his role and all that. All right. So you can see these are Hume's objections, and then we come back to the modern period in a way, and atheist philosophers are pointing to some of those so-called pointless evils, and together they're saying, so it's important to stress again, Hume himself did not conclude from these things that God did not exist. He simply concluded that God does not care. There may be a God, but it's a kind of deistic God. It simply does not concern itself with the universe. But the modern philosophers, Hume's followers, they conclude that it's highly improbable that God exists under these circumstances, given the fact that you have all of these cases of pointless evils and other scenarios where human life seems to be just miserable. All right. 10 minutes. Let's see how many slides. All right, I can go fast. So what are some of the assumptions in what I call the Humean approach? And again, I cannot go into the details of all of these arguments. It's all in the paper, but at least some outline. So when someone like Hume have all of these objections, if we pay close attention, we'd see there are assumptions. It's not like purely logical, mathematical, like beyond all doubts. So the first assumption is the assumption of anthropomorphism. By the way, if you look at many recent papers and arguments on the internet, you can see how many of these arguments are the repetitions of what Hume was saying. So the first assumption is the assumption of anthropomorphism, that is attributing, the way I'm defining here, arbitrary human characteristics to God. So we have this conception of God. Again, people are thinking that's the only conception, but if you are familiar with other traditions, this is coming from a specific Judeo-Christian Western understanding of God, where you think of God simply as a father-like figure, a huge man or something, and so you expect God to behave like humans. Oh, we see pain and we are moved by it, and so God should, and we think, oh, God should be like a human being, it should be moved to a similar emotion, feeling, and should be ready to do something about it. Well, whether God does something or not, that's a different issue. But it's simply an assumption that the way we react it's the same. We should expect the same from God as well, like in terms of our own emotions. So that's the first assumption, that the way we are thinking about God here. The second assumption is the assumption of the pleasure principle, what I call the pleasure, not from Freud. I mean, the terminology is his, but I'm just simply using it in a very commonsensical way. So the instinctive seeking of pleasure and avoiding of pain. So we think of human life, we think of our life, and we think, oh, we are here to just enjoy and please. And honestly, I mean, I don't want to say, but just wrote a book on the self and have been studying this for the last more than a decade. If you look at other traditions and so forth, and for example, the Greeks have this typology of hylikos, psychikos, and pneumatikos. There are people who simply take pleasure in physical things. Others, like artists and so forth, through imagination, maybe artistic creation. But there are also pneumatikos, people for whom it's knowledge, intellect itself. And Aristotle, I think in its metaphysics, very clear. All men desire to know, famous sentence. Not for something else's sake, but knowledge for knowledge's sake, because it's human nature, something about human nature, human intellect. So to simply assume that regardless of one's religion, we're here to enjoy, we're here to, our highest aspirations are about kind of pleasure and kind of have kind of robust social life, the way Hume was kind of enjoying in a way. It's a huge assumption. And then there's also this very common assumption, the assumption that the world is full of suffering, or at least, at the very least, life contains more suffering than joy. And finally, the assumption of a mechanistic worldview percolating into your epistemology, your anthropology, like the way you define human, you define ethics. Hume was very clear when he was writing the treatises, or especially in the treatise, like he tried to do what Newton did in his physics. And that's what I'm saying, Hume is a very controversial figure, philosophically speaking. So all of nature works according to mechanical laws, according to this kind of view, and everything in the material world can be explained in terms of the arrangement and movement of its parts. So these are the assumptions. Now, let's take a look at this from a slightly different point of view. So imagine, we don't want to answer it from Islamic philosophical perspectives, or Hindu for that matter, or Buddhist, whatever. Let's imagine there is no God, but let's try to see how atheism then would make sense of the horrible cases of pointless evil. Because I think it's natural to ask that question. Because, all right, the suffering, the cases of pointless suffering are real. So how would, the atheistic worldview answer this? So the atheist would invoke generally natural selection and the survival of the fittest. Like, according to current theory, the Earth is kind of 4.5 billion years old, and in this long period, only the stronger species survive. But even then, even they will be destroyed at one point, etc. But it's a excuse me. It's a blind and cruel process. It's the evolutionary process. In fact, even Richard Dawkins said natural selection is a very unpleasant process. It's not going to decide whether, or this is a case of it's a innocent child suffering, so let's make an exception. It's no, there's no self-consciousness or even consciousness. It's a blind process. So philosopher Eugene Nagasawa has come up with this term called systematic evil of nature in this perspective. So in this perspective, it's just random. Nature is random, indifferent, and kind of it does not care at all. It simply is the mechanistic outcome of this blind process. So you can say, if you have all of this pointless suffering, even more striking scenarios like, oh wow, I only have 4 minutes, or 4 to 5. Dr. Ristam, do you know how much time do I have?
You got about 5 minutes.
5 to 6 minutes, maybe 1 minute as a special. I'm kidding.
You can, you're the PI, so you can abuse your privilege a little bit.
Yeah, I want to abuse it. Just for 1 minute.
Oh, keep going. You have.
I'm kidding.
You're doing good.
All right. So yeah, so if it's just atheistic worldview, you can simply say it's the unfortunate consequences of the systematic evil of nature. It's pointless to question a blind process. So it stops there because there is no ontology beyond the natural world. Now, going back to all these objections and assumptions. So first of all, we need to decide when we read, when we come across all of these objections, we need to ask people, what is your conception of God? How are you thinking of God? Or whether that's the kind of right conception of God. As I said, a father-like figure who looks at his creation through human emotions, it's not the God that we have in many sophisticated tradition, I would say within Islam and also outside Islam. But in Islam, for example, people would make distinction between beyond being and being, or personal divinity and metapersonal divinity, or in Arabic, that the divine essence beyond all distinctions. It's the infinite reality of God, but also the names and calling God as personal in terms of personal in a being who has names and attributes, as in Islam. So in Islam, from the perspective of this, from this metaphysical perspective, the reason why we see evil or this kind of things is that there is opposition. We have opposition and diversity of the divine names. So in Islam, for example, God is not simply Al-Hadi, which is a positive attribute, the guide, but also the one who misguides, Al-Mudil. God is not simply Al-Ghaffar or forgiver, avenger in Al-Muntaqim. It's not only Ar-Rahman or the all-compassionate, he's also the one who can cause harm, and yes, who can harm and cause distress, Ad-Dar. That's what we have in the Quran. So it's not Manichaean perspective, by the way, because we have this distinction between the divine essence and the divine names. But you can see right there, it's not the simple father-like figure. So Hume's mistake is to conceive of God only in terms of beyond being. He's not able to understand this distinction between being and beyond being. And he's not able to see the fact that divine names, they're infinite, and the infinitude implies all possibility of all of these divine names that ultimately give birth to these endless manifestations of things, some of which are by definition imperfect, because it's coming from all possibility, which also contains the possibility of self-contradiction. Otherwise, it will be lacking in something. Rumi says it beautifully. If you want to be a perfect, it's like the case of a perfect painter. In order to show that you are really the greatest painter, you should be able to paint something, even an imperfect painting, so that you show that you have all these skills. And then the purpose of creation in this context, it's not pleasure. It's not also the custom-made paradise. It's not to create a human being who is weak and hedonistic and who only thinks of his or her own pleasure, but to think about human being in terms of its latent perfection. So there is a doctrine called al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human being. So in Islam, it's not like the original sin. The metaphysical reason why Adam was expelled from paradise, yes, forgiveness, forgetfulness, etc. But from another perspective, it's to realize the latent wholeness and perfection, and to become a symbol of God's perfection and love and goodness. So how does this happen? Through suffering and evil? So that's the question. I mean, unfortunately, I only have two, but I can address some more. But there's plenty of things that Rumi, Ibn Arabi, and Ghazali and others have. Unfortunately, we already have seen, like Hina and Cyrus, they already kind of outlined some of these things. So Rumi has this amazing story, for example. He's comparing Pharaoh and a grief-stricken man. So Pharaoh, who has everything, empire, rules the world, but Rumi says that God never graced Pharaoh with pain or tribulations or with suffering. Whereas the grief-stricken man does not have this empire, but he has all of these problems. But when he has all of these problems, he turns to God. As he turns to God, as Rumi says in Persian, it's really beautiful. Khondane bidad as afsodagist, khondane badad as delbardagist. So saying that the pain of the one who is kind of dull, like Pharaoh. The cry of someone like Pharaoh is kind of dull. He doesn't even pray to God. He doesn't even need to, because he feels no need to turn to God. Whereas the cry or the prayer of the grief-stricken man is full of ecstasy. Ecstasy, yes, but painful ecstasy. So suffering allows, those who have that tendency to turn inward and to develop this inward bond with God. And so some of the things Hume was saying, oh, why is it that we don't have this and we don't have that? We have idleness, we have hunger. Well, and sometimes we do things, we get tired. Well, it's a relative matter. Because people fast during the Ramadan. If you fast for the first time, you'd feel kind of pain and so forth. But a lot of people explain, say that when they fast for a long period, especially during the month of Ramadan, they don't feel any kind of tiredness, or they actually want to continue. The same is the case in many other such practices. So there are all these different examples that one can cite. So that shows suffering has all of these issues, but at the same time, there are all of these responses. But just to conclude, when it comes to evil and suffering in the world, it seems sort of unreasonable to think that God, we have all of these cases of pointless suffering, and kind of God owes us everything, whereas we owe him nothing, like we bear no responsibility and so forth. So when confronted with evil and suffering, so instead of asking, so this is my kind of concluding sentence. Instead of asking, where is God? It makes more sense to ask, where are you? All right, I think that was it. Yeah, he was coming to take revenge, obviously.
Thank you very much, Muhammad. Okay, so that was very good, and there's obviously a lot of room for serious discussion here. What we're going to do is I'm going to take a few of the questions. I'm going to field them now so that we can then open up the room for Muhammad Mansouri's lecture. So again, a number of them have been coming in, a number of questions have been coming in. So I'm going to first of all prioritize those who've not had questions addressed, and then also some comments. So we'll try to limit it just to a few. Anthony Shakir, he thanks you, and he says Hume sounds even more ridiculous than when I first studied him as an undergrad. After him and the society he represented, the world seems to have been turned on its head. Okay, that was a comment. Good. Okay. Now, a question from Fozia Khan. Where did it go? Oh, well, here. Atheism seems to consequentially equate with meaninglessness and finding meaning in self-worship, pride and narcissism, and materialism. So she's asking, is atheism to be equated with meaninglessness? And I guess the way people find meaning if they're atheists would be through self-worship, that is to say the cult of the self, self-admiration. Is that kind of the gap that an atheist materialist would try to fill? Because there's no God to worship, there's the self then to worship?
So they're atheists, but Camus was going for total meaninglessness. Although they both ultimately believe life has no meaning and so forth, but Sartre, for example, was, these are popular figures, by the way. These days, maybe somewhat forgotten, but anyway, Sartre thought, for example, still think about freedom and so forth. Nietzsche, definitely not a believer, atheist, and he thought of self-creation. So you can be a nihilist, but there are atheists who believe life can be meaningful even without believing God and so forth. So it really depends, and there's a kind of spectrum. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good. Very good. Now, Nicholas Boylston has a very detailed question. What I'm going to do...
I know, after such...
It's a very long one, but I'm going to limit it to just the last one, because that directly... he has two questions. One's an observation, one's a question. That first question, it's something that I think we should probably address at the end of the conference, because it's a very pertinent question concerning the question of the divine limitation on mercy vis-a-vis the question of suffering, or is it a question of openness and complete freedom from the part of the divine? And that deals with human anthropology, and we can deal with that in a couple of days. But let's save that question, Nicholas, the first one. Sorry, I called him Nicholson because he and I are thinking a lot about Rumi these days. But his other question, the one that we can address right now, he says he's basically asking, your suggestion about the purpose of creation, how does it relate to the examples from Rowe that you had given?
So yeah, for Rowe, obviously, ultimately, all of these pointless evils show that there is no kind of divine purpose and so forth. But I also argue, which I was not able to address in the talk, that for a theist, you don't have to simply think about God's existence only through the phenomena or the question of evil. There are cosmological arguments. For example, I mean, it's a very complicated argument, but not just purely logical. I call it onto-cosmological. It's the idea that when you think about the world, creation, human beings, there's a question of contingency. We are contingent beings. No one would doubt that. All the theists, atheists, whoever, I mean, no one would claim that I'm an absolute figure like God, because we don't create ourselves. So it's something like radical contingency, even if it involves an infinite series possible without, like going infinitely backward or forward, whichever, backward, or there has to be a terminal. So Avicenna and others would argue that no, the radical contingency of the world proves that there is a necessary being. Of course, in modern, what I call speculative modern physics, like Hawking and others who talk about the so-called time and space kind of dissolving when it comes to singularity, the initial point, but those are kind of stuff, not, you can speculate only. No one has kind of really, have seen, or it's even hard to think about the scenario. But anyway, leaving that aside, there are various forms of arguments that talk about the contingency of our situation, the nature of the world, which proves the existence of a necessary being. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, in the Islamic tradition, you don't have the question of evil as a kind of clear-cut problem. If you look at the writings of Avicenna, if you look at the writings of Mullah Sadra and others, you'd always see this is coming under the main topic of providence, inayah. That's the main topic. And in the Quran and in literature, this is always seen as something that's part and parcel of the world. The Quran has all of these verses about the nature of the world, which is it's full of false pleasure, or it's a kind of form of illusion. But within this paradigm, you can still find God, you can still find truth, and so forth. So, and the spiritual tradition also rhymes with that. So if you take those things into consideration, then you are now in a position to address the goal of creation from the perspective of Islamic metaphysics, where the goal is human perfection. So when we are deeply troubled, and especially I think about this example, when suddenly you wake up and suddenly you discover you have this kind of really deep illness, something, God forbid, and so forth, and you used to be a different person until the day before, but now you realize your movement, mental, physical, many of these things will be limited. Now, you cannot do a lot of the external activities that you're involved in. You're forced to turn inward. You're forced to develop the attitude of gratitude and kind of thankfulness and patience. And most of all, finding that peace in the center of your being. That takes a lot of effort. It's not theoretical. It's one thing to exhaust. And then also there's the question of love, by the way. And again, so, I would say, it's only in those circumstances that kind of propel us to kind of take a deeper look within ourselves, because the goal is to really know ourselves, know what we are capable of in light of what God has given us, or in light of divine manifestation, you might say.
Thank you very much. As you were saying that there's that hikam of Ibn Ata'illah that came to mind, where he says, "Man lam yati ilayhi bi qala'id al-imtihan, siqa ilayhi bi salasil al-imtihan." Right? He who, khair. Okay, good. Thank you very much, Muhammad. That was wonderful. You fielded the questions very well. A number of others have come. I've asked one or two of them to save them for the final panel because we'll have more time to discuss them.